Hi, Professor Rapetti here, and our lecture today is about folks I'm calling post-Socratics, which contrasts with the pre-Socratics, everyone who came before Socrates. And although Plato and Aristotle came after Socrates, the three of them are the three major philosophers of the Socratic era. And then these other philosophers who came after Socrates. I'm calling them the post-Socratics. So this is the first of two lectures on the post-Socratics about the Epicureans and the Stoics. Okay. All right. So a little bit of historical context. You've got the rise of the global Roman Empire and the collapse of the global Greek Empire after Alexander the Great passed. Of course, he took over the known world. So the known world was ruled by the Greeks, and they eventually kind of lost control and the Roman Empire grew. And right around the time of the first really important post-Socratic philosopher, Epicurus, was around the time of Jesus, the time of the Roman Empire, right? Also the end of the Socratic period. A number of philosophers followed in the footsteps of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, including the post-Socratics, all right? But it was the end of a kind of golden age of Greece. Greece was under the rule of the Roman Empire after having ruled the world. So this is a terrible feeling of cultural loss. When you're in occupied land, you're not able to govern your own city-states. All Greek peoples are subjected to the Romans. There's a name for this domicide, which is the loss of your domicile, which is your home, loss of the sense of a homeland. And this is triggering a meaning crisis, right? The Greek religion had been, polytheism had been sort of losing its credibility ever since the pre-Socratics and the Socratics came along, questioning everything and giving natural explanations for natural phenomena, right? So the Greek culture was in jeopardy. The Greek religion was no longer a credible source of meaning or purpose or guidance. And the response, you might want to say, from the post-Socratics is a kind of philosophy of acceptance, right? It's a kind of fatalistic mood in the air where the previous gods no longer existed and no longer defined things, right? It's a kind of negative experience. And we're going through a kind of meaning crisis today in the modern era. After the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, right, all of our religious belief systems in the West have suffered a lot with the rise of science, right? So it's a similar kind of thing. Okay, so Epicurus was the first major philosopher. And my dates are wrong over there because I've got, the Hellenistic period goes for 3 centuries. That's right. I said it wrong before, and I said it around the time of Jesus. It kind of ends around, the time of Jesus in the middle. In any event, it's called the Hellenistic period, and it goes for about 3 centuries after the death of Alexander the Great, who died in 323. Alexander's teacher, Aristotle, died in 322. Don't worry so much about the dates. Just have a rough idea of the period. Right, Epicurus lived from 341 to 271. So that's about 70 years. He had a materialistic metaphysics. What's your metaphysics? Your metaphysics is your belief about what reality is. So if you're a materialist, you think all there is the physical world. His epistemology was empirical, like the Ionians. He was an empiricist, which means he believed in all of our knowledge comes from the senses, right? He was a hedonist in his ethics. So you've got his metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, the three main fields of philosophy. Hedonistic, which means pretty much sensual, enjoying the present life while you have it. We'll say more about that because there's two different senses of that. He was an atomist, like Democritus, the pre-Socratic, who believed that everything was made out of atoms, or understandable in atomic terms, which are natural, not supernatural. So he rejected Plato's forms, which were abstract, intelligible, supernatural type entities that lived in another world. The world, there's a split in the two worlds in Plato, right? The invisible but intelligible world, and then the visible but really not really intelligible world of our senses, right? So that he rejected that, along with the soul, that we have an immaterial soul. Aristotle thought the soul was just a feature of the body, not something supernatural. And he rejected the gods and their influence. He also rejected skepticism. There were some skeptics around, right? He believed that knowledge is attainable and it's very simple, and you acquire it through your senses. He was an empiricist, right? He also thought that we all aim to attain pleasure, tranquility, right? And those two things aren't exactly the same. We'll talk about them later, but tranquility was the real goal. But pleasures in and of themselves are not painful, so they're superior to pain. But even better than pleasure or pain is tranquility, being untouched by either positive or negative experiences. And how do you attain that? By limiting your desires. So if your desires lead you to want more and more pleasures and avoid more and more pains, right? And also eliminating fear of gods, which was a popular thing. And still the Greeks, some of them were believing in the gods, right? The culture was shifting, and fear of death. We'll say more about all these things. It's a kind of philosophy of freedom, despite the kind of collapse, the domicide, the death of one's homeland, right? And the death of self-rule, and the collapse of the Greek Empire, the rise of the Roman Empire, subjugation under the Romans. So a philosophy of acceptance on the one hand, but freedom on the other, right? We get our freedom somewhere else, not from being in charge of things, but philosophically. Okay, so I said we go through each of these things. So his metaphysics was materialism and atomism, right? All there is the material world. That's physis, if you recall, from the pre-Socratics. Gods, even if they exist in some way, shape, or form, are irrelevant, right? We are material beings, right? Living in a material world. There are no souls. Therefore, this life is all that we have, right? So you might as well live for today and embrace the ordinary pleasures of life, which is Epicurean. Okay, we'll say more about that later. His epistemology, once again, empiricism, right? If you're a materialist, then you believe in only the physical world. So epistemologically, it makes sense that you would be an empiricist, that you would believe your senses, which contact the physical world, tell you how that world is, right? There's only the physical world. The senses are in contact with it. Therefore, the senses are the source of information about it and the source of knowledge. There's no other world to know. There's no other epistemic tools, right, other than the five senses, right? Ideas and knowledge develop in our minds as a result of our sensory experiences, the five senses. That's a scientific attitude, and it's also the attitude of common sense realism, right? Seeing is believing. I'll believe it when I see it, right? Or smell it, hear it, taste it, or touch it. Okay, his ethics is typically called hedonism, but also known as Epicureanism. But what is hedonism? Well, hedonism is the view, as in the diagram, that the only things that matter are pleasure and pain. Pleasure is naturally good and pain is naturally evil, right? And so ethics is natural and material and physicalistic, right? These are natural values. And the word hedon in Greek means pleasure, or feeling rather, right? Feeling, positive feelings, negative feelings. Have more positive ones, have less negative ones, or be in the middle, be neutral. Neutral is good and positive is good. Negative is bad. Eliminating negative is good, right? So hedonism is the view that all feeling creatures, all sentient beings, are always motivated by considerations of attraction to pleasure and avoidance of pain, right? But these are somewhat ambiguous ideas. Pleasure, right? There's more abstract things like happiness, well-being, flourishing. You could have happiness and well-being and flourish as the kind of creature you are, member of your species, right? If you're a plant, you can flourish if you have enough sunlight, water, and good soil, right? Without having any pleasure. Same thing if you have sensations, as long as you're in the neutral zone, you might not have any pleasure, but you could still have well-being and you might be happy, right? So we need to differentiate between those things. All right, so now, and here's a way to differentiate between two different models of hedonism or Epicureanism, the ancient versus the modern. Let's talk about the modern one first, because that's the one we all know about, right? In modern hedonism, it's all about pleasure, right? But we could distinguish between two different versions of that: descriptive versus prescriptive. Descriptive just observationally describes the way things are. Prescription, when your doctor gives you a prescription, he's prescribing behavior you ought to perform, right? So prescriptive is moral hedonism. Descriptive is kind of just factual, like zoological or anthropological or biological hedonism, right? So descriptive hedonism, as it says on the slide, is just the view that all sentient beings are motivated by considerations of, I put plus or minus, meaning positive or negative feelings, which is pleasure or pain, right? And therefore, descriptive hedonists think all manners of sensual pleasure, right, are what attract us, and all manners of sensual pain are what we are averse to. So sensual pleasures: gourmet food, gourmet wine, fine music, fine clothing, entertainment, consumerism, excitement, joyrides, fun and games, video games, you name it. Maybe you're a descriptive hedonist, that this is what you do. So it's a question of, descriptive hedonism is just the view that that's what actually motivates all of us to act, our desire for pleasure and our desire to avoid pain, right? Moralistic hedonism, or just prescriptive hedonism, says, since that's all that matters, that's all that ought to matter. You ought to pursue pleasure and you ought to avoid pain, right? That would be, and there are some prescriptive hedonists. Okay, the ancient one was not so much about hedonism, but about this idea called ataraxia, which is kind of like eudaimonia, which, if you recall, is well-being or happiness or flourishing, right? Ataraxia is tranquility or inner peace, peace of mind, peace of soul, right? And the theory is that moderation, I'm simplifying it, but moderation leads to peace of mind. Excess pleasure, right? Running after pleasures and running away from pains, right? Being addicted or attached to pleasures and paranoid about pain or disappointment. Both of those are extremes of pleasure and pain, right? But moderation is in the middle. You know, a certain amount of pleasure and a certain amount of pain are consistent with peace of mind, well-being, flourishing, and happiness, right? Both pain and unfulfilled desires agitate the mind, right? So having lots of desires and cravings and everything that you can't satisfy, that's going to destroy your inner peace, right? Or taking a lot of drugs that will give you temporary pleasures might in the long run destroy your inner peace, right? So their strategy was, don't get too caught up in pleasures. Don't get too caught up in running away from pains, right? Reduce your pain and reduce your desires, simplify your life, and satisfy the desires that you can without going overboard, everything in moderation. Okay, so that's the difference between ancient and modern. Ancient was like sex, drugs, modern is like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? Let's just have fun, fun, fun. Girls just want to have fun, right? But ancient was more like, peace of mind, balance, calm, moderation, self-control, right? These are radically different conceptions. Okay. So interestingly, I said Epicurus had attitudes about life and death. Since all there is this life in the body, Then materialism is his metaphysics, right? All we have is a material world, no supernatural world, only a natural world. And that's a kind of realism. Let's get real. All there is this life. You don't know if there's an afterlife, right? Well, at least Protagoras said, we don't know. Life is too short. But Epicurus is saying, no, none of that makes sense. All that makes sense is what we could see, smell, hear, taste, and touch. And all that stuff is material, right? Therefore, all that matters is material well-being, enjoyment, happiness, peace of mind in this life. One of his attitudes was getting involved in politics does not bring peace of mind. So he's got a kind of anti-political attitude, right? And maybe you could see all those protesters last year, right? All over the world, like they don't look too happy and they don't look like they have peace of mind as they're looting and burning things down and turning over police cars and all of that, just to, make a point. His attitude is, don't get involved in that stuff, right? And that you might want to think, remember what I said, it's a philosophy of acceptance. Well, politics is trying to resist the Romans after the Greek Empire fell. That's not going to give you tranquility. You could have peace of mind, well-being, and happiness independently of who's in charge, right? Okay. So yes, we can attain ataraxia by living wisely, by reducing pain and reducing desire. We could have some pain, have some pleasures, enjoy what we can, but moderation is the key virtue for Epicurus. This is his philosophy of life. His attitude about death, we're on a new slide now. They look the same in case you didn't notice. Life, death, life, death. Okay, let's go to death, right? The fear of death is irrational. Here's a famous saying that I hope you remember, because whenever you fear death, remember this and treat it like a mantra. Quote, where I am, death is not. Where death is, I am not. In other words, where I am, when I'm conscious, when I'm alive, I'm not dead. And when I'm dead, I don't exist, right? I won't exist. So you can't experience death. You can experience dying and pain taking over you and losing consciousness, but all those are living experiences that happen just before you die, right? I don't mean to be morbid, but if you can't experience death if there's no other world. Of course, if you think there is life after death, then you think he's wrong. But if he's right, that this is all there is, right? And that's what he truly believes, that this is all there is, right? Then you can't even experience death. There's no experiencer left, right? So if you can't experience death, it can't have a negative value for you. There's nothing to be afraid of. Death is totally painless, right? And he says, okay, look, we say, oh, well, there'll be a loss of my life. I'm going to no longer exist for all of eternity after I die. Well, this is the last bullet. If it's a loss knowing that you will no longer exist for eternity, is it a loss knowing that you didn't exist for all of eternity before you were born? No, you just didn't exist. There was no way for you to experience the lack of your existence. When you don't exist, you don't experience the lack of anything or the addition of anything, right? And when you came into existence, that had nothing to do with your non-existence prior to that. It's like you exist and then you fail to exist, right? So it's really interesting, rational processing about the fear of death, right? Something to remember. You might want to even apply this, well, the Stoics will do this, to the conditions that might lead to your death. Of course, you want to try to avoid anything that might lead to your death. But if it's something beyond your control, like you get on an airplane, once you're on that plane and it takes off, you can't control whether or not the plane is going to go down, right? You get a little nervous and everything. But if you think about it in the same way, like there's nothing I can do about it, right? So if I die, I die. It might be a little painful right before I do, depending on how that plane goes down. But all right, enough of this morbid stuff. Let's move on. Let's talk about the Stoics. Yeah, and this lesson hopefully will be a relatively short one. So you've got Marcus Aurelius over there on the horse, He's the Roman emperor and famous philosopher king type character. And by the way, in Plato's Republic, he says that the model society should be ruled by a philosopher king, right? Fascinating book. I highly recommend it. He was not only a philosopher king, but probably the greatest Roman emperor, Caesar, that ever existed, all right, in the whole history of the Roman Empire. On the other hand, on the right side of the screen, you've got Epictetus, who was a slave. So this makes it really interesting when you think about it, that my third bullet down below, this is obviously a philosophy for everyone. From the lowest station in life, you can't get lower in station in life than a slave, right? All the way up to the highest station, which is a philosopher king, right? Not just a king, but one of the greatest kings, well loved and respected by all, right? So, this is a philosophy for everyone, right? And what's the implication on my last bullet? Well, philosophy definitely transcends sociology and politics. I should have put that there, and politics, right? It has nothing to do with your station in life, right? So take that in for a moment. Think about that. It's a philosophy for everyone. And it transcends wherever you are in life or whatever you're going to become. Philosophy can be meaningful. And both the slave and the king found the philosophy of the Stoics, Stoicism, extremely rewarding and practical and meaningful and soothing. Okay, so here's that quote from Epictetus. Epicurus is the philosopher who founded the hedonistic Epicureanism. Epictetus, or Epictetus, as some like to say, was the first major Stoic, right? One of the first, I think he was the first major one, I forget. If you are ever tempted, quote, if you're ever tempted to look outside for outside approval, realize that you have compromised your own integrity, right? It's if your epistemology, your own inner philosophy doesn't matter. You're looking to someone else for approval. If you, continuing with the quote, if you need a witness, be your own witness, end of quote. Epictetus. All right. Now, this is a really deep and meaningful philosophy, and there's a revival of it going on today. In fact, in the next few days, by the time you see this, it'll be over with. Otherwise, I would have put the link in here. There's an all-day Stoic, it's called Stoicon. It's a Stoic conference, and they used to happen in Greece, in the UK, and all around the world, one day a year or more than a day. Now, because of the pandemic, they're online, so anybody can go, and they're making it much more affordable by donation only. You don't even have to buy a ticket. But you can look it up, Google it, and keep a record of Stoicon. You might have, like I said, you might have missed this one, or you might be able to see a video about it online, I'm sure, at some point. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so ancient Stoicism with a capital S versus modern Stoicism with a lowercase s. So you see my little picture of Einstein there. Stoic, capital S, is not equal to Stoic, lowercase s. So modern folks, when they say, oh, he's being Stoic, or that guy's a Stoic, right? For the most part, unless you're literally a follower of Stoicism with a capital S, lowercase s just means it's like an adjective. It means something like you are emotionless, right? Like robotic or something. You just accept life. You accept fate, right? You grin and bear it. You have a kind of whatever attitude towards everything. No emotion, stiff upper lip. You're unfazed. You don't care. I don't care, right? I don't care. That's a kind of Stoic attitude. But ancient Stoicism, well, it was Stoic in the modern sense in one respect. Stoic, and I mentioned this earlier, Stoic towards whatever's beyond our control. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but not Stoic in the modern sense toward anything that is under our control, right? They're stoic about things in the modern sense that aren't under our control. We can't control them, so why resist them? That's futile, right? Resistance is futile. But anything under our control is something we shouldn't be stoic about in the modern sense, right? So that's the key distinction. And this is the primary principle of Stoicism, the distinction between what is and what is not under our control, okay? No sense worrying about or reacting to what's inevitable, right? I mean, once that plane is going down, you might as well just try to enjoy the ride. If there was, pretzels there, eat your last couple of pretzels on the way down. Just joking. But the attitude of the Stoics is that it's completely irrational to worry about anything beyond your control. And that's the same thing as Epicurus is, who's not a Stoic, he's an Epicurean, his attitude towards death, right? There's nothing you can do about it. And there's no sense worrying about it. Once it happens, you don't even experience it. You don't suffer from it. It's the end of all suffering, right? So it's irrational to worry about death, right? But the Stoics extend that same kind of attitude towards it's irrational to worry about anything beyond your control. If you can't do anything about it, don't waste your time thinking about it, right? Life deals you lemons, make lemonade. That's a Stoic attitude, right? If there are things that you could do to make better the things that you can't control, right? By making better the things that you can control, that's making lemonade out of the lemons that life dealt you, right? This is a saying. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but here's another key idea that the Buddhists share. When we'll get to the Buddhists later in this semester, right? Stress is not really external stress, right? I have an unequal sign, just an abbreviation. Stress does not equal external phenomena happening to you. Those are not really stress. Stress is internal. Stress is how you respond to external things, right? So think about two different kinds of people. One who's jarred by everything that happens to him, every little thing makes him anxious and nervous and recoils in fear, and he worries, and all these things are going on that affect him, right? The exact same things could be happening to someone else who has a Stoic attitude, right? And so they don't get perturbed by any of those things. Psychological or experienced stress, you might want to say, oh, there are external stressors like cold weather or fire or disease, right? Or poverty or all sorts of things, right? But how you handle those things is what makes them stressful or not, right? That's a very deep Stoic insight worth really meditating on. Okay. So I said the main principle of Stoicism is this idea about what you can and cannot control. And it's called the dichotomy of control. Dichotomy just means when you have two things that are opposite each other, right? You've got a dichotomy. A dilemma involves a dichotomy. When you've got two things that are opposite of each other and both of them are bad and you don't know what to do, you have a dilemma. Di, by the way, means two. And lemma means branches. No matter where I go this way or that way, I've got a problem. How do I solve it? That's a dilemma. Dichotomy, I forget what this dichotomy thing means, but di means two. So it's a similar word. Okay. So the Greek word for control is kratia. And the Greek word for non-control, you put an A in front of it, but I'm not sure why it's not akratia, but it's akrasia or akrasia, we say in English, which is the difference between control and non-control. And krasia is like in democracia, right? The demos is the people, and kratia or krasia have to do with control. The people are in control in a democracy, they vote, right? So the word akrasia or akrasia also, this is in the second, the gray box, right, is often used by philosophers to mean weakness of will, right? I'm not in control of my desires or my will. I know I shouldn't have another glass of wine or another cigarette or another piece of chocolate cake, but I can't help myself. I have weak will, right? we call that akrasia or akrasia, right? And it's a failure of control under conditions that normally enable control, right? That's weakness of will. Now, this is kind of philosophically interesting thing that I'm throwing in here, right? Free will has to do with having the kind of control over your will, over your desires and your intentions and your wants and your motives and your craving and all that, right? If you can control that the way and effectively so that you have the will, the desires, the intentions, and the actions that you want to have, we say that you have some kind of freedom of will, right? But when you can't control your own desires and actions, right, you're failing. Your will, you're experiencing a failure of will or a failure of control, akrasia. But some things are not under our control at all, right? So in a sense, the non-control thing, like the Stoics are more concerned with the things that are external to us and not under our control. Everything internal to us, our beliefs, our desires, our emotions, all of those things are at least in principle under our control, right? But out of habit, of giving into desires that we know we shouldn't give into, we weaken our control. We have weakness of will, right? But that's something we can work on. We can't work on conditions outside of us like the weather and whatnot, but we can work on umbrellas and stuff like that, right? So that's the whole idea about Stoicism. Restrict your attention and your efforts to things that you can control, right? So now we're on the second row, the green box, right? You can't really control. You could try. There are things that you could do to improve your health or try to maintain it, but you might catch a disease, right? There are things that you can do to develop wealth or reputation, but you can get robbed, identity theft, right? People can ruin your reputation, right? You can't control the economy. You can contribute to it. You can't control the weather. So all those things in the green box, you could use an umbrella, and whatnot. So there are small ways in which you can make efforts to control some aspects of those things, but ultimately they're not under your control, right? Some things are completely under our control, right? And that's the orange box. And then the list of them is in the darker gray box. Our reactions to things, right? How we respond to the external stressors of life is what determines whether or not they're actually stressful, experienced as stressors by us, right? You've got the kind of hippie, reggae, Rastafarian kind of attitude, like ain't nothing going to break my stride, right? Somebody who goes with the flow, right? They don't care about the stresses, the traffic, the loudness and whatnot. They're cool, they're chill, right? They're kind of stoic in the ancient sense, right? So that's just about the external stresses, but then all the other internal stuff, how we react to them is internal, but our decisions, our deliberations, our emotions, our actions, our thoughts, right? Our choices, all that stuff, even how good our memory is a muscle, how fit your body is, you can do what you can to be healthy, right? Even if uncontrollable things happen and steal your health from you, okay? So wisdom is the key virtue because it helps us to differentiate between what we can and can't control and where we should and shouldn't pay attention, right? Between control and non-control, kratia and akrasia, right? Wisdom tells you focus on what you can control. Don't waste your time worrying about death and so on, right? Okay, so given that philosophy, there's that's like an axiom or a postulate, and we could then infer the next thing that comes from this, almost like a mathematical inference, right? Like in geometry, you have a certain principle, and then you can infer something logically from it. You get a theorem based on that axiom. I don't know if you learned that in your education about the way axioms or postulates allow us using logic to deduce theorems, but I'm saying that what's on this slide can be deduced from the dichotomy of control in a way, maybe with some other principles helping out. But the idea is that there are things that we should be indifferent to, right? But we can still prefer some of them and disprefer the others. But we should be indifferent to whatever the outcome is, right? We can't control the outcomes. We can control our efforts towards certain outcomes. Like our efforts to maintain our health, our efforts to maintain our wealth, our efforts to maintain our reputation, and so on, right? To stay dry when it's raining out, right? We can only control our efforts. We can't control whether or not the world will reward our efforts with the expected results that we predict, right? So we should prefer health and wealth, good reputation, staying dry in the rain, all those kinds of things, right? We should prefer the opposites, sickness, disease, poverty, suffering, etc., right? But whichever one happens, the Stoic attitude is to be indifferent, because once it happens, there's nothing you can do about it. So that's how the dichotomy of control plays out. Well, we can prefer things that's under our control, to prefer things and to try to make them come about that we want, and to disprefer things or dislike things that we don't want to happen, and we can make efforts for them not to happen, right? But that's all we can do, is we can prefer and disprefer, and we can make the appropriate efforts for both, right? So that we get the things we prefer and we avoid the things that we don't prefer, right? But we can't control whether or not we're successful. So whatever the outcome is, we should be indifferent to both, right? Indifferent to pleasure and pain, right? Enjoy the pleasure, suffer the pain, but don't be so fragile that unless you're enjoying pleasure, or unless you're not suffering from pain, that you should have peace of mind, which is like ataraxia, right? Which is what the Epicureans also want, right? So health, wealth, pleasure, good reputation, longevity, living long, success, right? We prefer all of those, but we should be indifferent if we fail to achieve them, because whether we achieve them or not is mostly out of our control. But you know what? You students, right? You have control to make more efforts as students to do a better job, learn more, and be more successful in life. That's something you can control, right? So there's a big difference between not making the kinds of efforts that you can and should make in order to achieve your goals, right? And therefore not achieving them because you didn't try hard enough and say, oh, well, it was out of my control. No, a lot of it is under your control. So don't act like it's not, and then use that as an excuse, right? This doesn't mean that you shouldn't make lots of effort. No, effort is under your control. Outcomes are not under your control. Some might be in some small way, but that's about it. Right? Same thing with the dispreferred indifference, right? We don't want sickness. We don't want poverty. We don't want pain. We don't want bad reputation. We don't want a short-lived life. We don't want to be failures in life, right? But no matter what happens, as long as you do everything that's under your control, you shouldn't regret anything, right? But if you wind up failing because you failed to do what you should have done, that's something worth regretting, right? Okay. So what should we do? Cultivate the virtues that are based on this insight about the dichotomy of control and preferred and dispreferred indifference, right? What virtues? Primarily wisdom, right? Because wisdom also tells you how to cultivate. Remember Aristotle? It's the primary virtue. It tells you how to cultivate the right amount of all the other virtues. How much courage? Not too much, not too little. How much acceptance? Not too much, not too little, but all of those things on the list there, those are just examples of virtues based on the insight of dichotomy of control. Acceptance, right? Accepting the things that you can't control, right? But making effort, right? Being diligent and courage to try to make the world turn out the way you want it to for yourself. That takes courage and a risk, right? So being diligent and proactive, those are also virtues. Right? Being sober, having certain, doesn't mean you can't have drinks every now and then, but don't become so intoxicated that you're stupid and no longer rational. That's something you can control. So don't let that happen to yourself. Equanimity, which is being unfazed by pleasure or pain, right? Enjoy the pleasure, suffer the pain, but don't be fazed by either one that comes to you beyond your control. That will help you have some serenity, inner peace, and also some patience, right? When the negative is happening, you have to be patient. Patience is related to acceptance. Okay, so now let's move on. Yes, because we were just leading into this. You may or may not have heard of the serenity prayer. And the serenity prayer is very popular in 12-step addiction recovery programs like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or any of these other things, right? And it goes something like this. There are slightly different versions of it, but God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I'm saying that the serenity prayer, that's called the serenity prayer. It's a Stoic mantra. It's been adopted by Christianity. It's a Christian prayer at this point, right? And the Stoics may or may not have prefaced it with God grant me the ... which is why that's separate on the slide, because some of them believed in something like God and some of them didn't. And belief in God seems to have been a kind of optional thing. All right, but let's go through this prayer, right? Let's say it's aspirational, whether you believe there's a God or not. Like, may the universe grant me, or may life grant me, or may I be fortunate enough to bring it about that I have the serenity. May I cultivate the serenity, which is the inner peace, to accept the things I can't change. There's the dichotomy of control, right? Right? The ability to accept what I can't change, it requires a kind of inner non-reactivity to those things. Second thing, the courage to change the things I can, right? That means the things I can control, right? If I can control something, I could change it. If I can't control it, I can't change it. It's going to change or not change independently of my control, right? But courage is not just the courage to stand up to a bully, right, or some scary situation, but to take risks in life, to devote yourself to projects that might fail, right? Courage is multidimensional, right? And courage comes from the Latin, I don't know how to say it in Latin, but I know in Italian and Spanish, cuore in Italian and corazon in Spanish means heart, right? Courage is like heart edge, right? The heart, the spirit, right? To go forth into the unknown. We're all feeling our way around in the dark, right? So shine forth into your future with effort and diligence. Be not afraid. Have the courage to try to change the things that you can, okay? And this, a recent phenomenon that most young people can maybe look at as an example is people trying to change the political dynamic in the country through protest. I'm not sure I agree with what they're protesting for. Depends on which protest it is, right? But that's courage to try to change things that you think you can change. Some people would think, no, you can't fight City Hall. That's a fatalistic attitude. It's not a Stoic attitude. It's an Epicurean attitude. The Epicurus said, politics is not good for your emotional well-being and for your tranquility, right? But the Stoics are not apolitical. Apolitical means non-political, right? No, they want the courage to try to change the things that in principle might be under our control, right? Which is the structure of society, the laws and stuff like that. Okay, and of course, the most important thing is the wisdom to know the difference between what I can and cannot change. All right. So I say it's a mantra of this philosophy, like in Buddhism or in Hinduism, there are mantras, which are sayings or prayers, or even just a word that you repeat over and over again, like a meditation, right? Great way to start or end the day. Affirmation, you could just consider it an affirmation, right? May I have the strength, the wisdom, the courage, or the serenity or whatever. Make your own mantra. Okay. So I said, God grant me that part of it might not be absolutely necessary for Stoicism. Though most early Stoics were somewhat religious, but not in the same sense that we are, right? They believed in this concept, the logos, which is kind of like that other concept of nous, which is mind, right? But Heraclitus is the one, the pre-Socratic empiricist Ionian, right, who said, you can't step into the same river twice. Everything is in a constant state of change, which he thought was represented by the fire element. Remember, even things that are slow burning, right? They're still, they don't look like they're changing. That's because change or fire in them is so slow moving. right? But he also thought that what structures and organizes the whole thing is logos, which literally means word, but with the capital L, it means words are, what are words? They convey information only if you know how to decrypt them. They are crypted or encrypted, right? Like when you put it into a code so nobody can read your email, it's encrypted. You need the decryption to be able to tell what it means. So information that's crypted, right, is words. If you don't know a language, you don't know what the words mean. They are encrypted in a code that only speakers of the language know, right? So if you know a language that your friends don't know, and you can talk to somebody about them and they won't know you're talking about them, right? Happened to me once, and I figured out what people were saying because I had a few ideas about what certain words meant. We'll leave that little funny story out of here. But the idea is that the whole universe is filled with information. You just need to be able to decode it, right? There's a cosmic order. The whole world seems intelligent and rational and meaningful, right? Heraclitus said something about fire coming in and out of things in equal measure. It almost sounds like he's trying to talk about the laws of thermodynamics or laws of physics, right? If you substitute the word energy for the word fire, he thought that the world is on fire, it's energy constantly changing, and there are laws that are rational principles that balance the whole thing out and make it into a system, right? That's the logos. It's a mystical idea that the Christians took up because I forget, who is it? Paul in the gospel, according to Paul, I think it is. One of them, John, Paul, I forget who. The opening line of that gospel is, in the beginning was the word. And it was written in Greek. And it said, in the beginning was the logos with a capital L, right? This cosmic principle. Okay, so it's a God-like idea, but not necessarily the same as our conception of God as some guy in the sky with a beard, you know, and a deep voice who spoke to Moses and stuff like that, or Abraham. Okay, most contemporary Stoics dropped the logos part of it, at least a supernaturalistic interpretation of the logos. They still believe that we're in a rationally ordered universe, but they align more with the materialistic or naturalistic view of the world or metaphysics, as opposed to supernaturalistic interpretation of logos, right? And in that regard, they're similar to the Epicureans, the modern Stoics, right? They're more materialistic or scientifically oriented, right? Some of them embrace pantheism, which has theism in it, which means belief in God or something supernatural, and pan, which means all, so that everything is somehow or another divine in some sense, or that the whole physical world is God or is the equivalent of God, or it's sacred. There's all different versions of pantheism. Very few modern Stoics ascribe to pantheism, but some of them do. But both the ancient and the modern Stoics endorse somewhat what are called ascetic practices. Ascesis is the original Greek word. I forget exactly what it means, but fasting is an ascetic practice, or going without sleep or without sex are ascetic practices. Fasting is not acting on your desires, right, for food or drink, but it can be that same principle of not acting on your desires can be applied to smoking cigarettes or getting high, smoking pot, drinking wine, having sex, speaking, right? Engaging in anything, using your cell phone, right? You can fast from all of these things. Those are ascetic practices, right? And they don't encourage you to be an ascetic person who's always fasting, right? But that you should periodically exercise your ability to fast one way or another, just to cultivate your strength of will, right? The opposite of weakness of will, to cultivate your self-control, right? To control your desires and not act on them, right? One way of just looking at this is to think of when you have a desire, right? Let's say you're thirsty, you see the world through your desire in a thirstily way, or in a thirsty way. You can kind of notice what can be drunk in the environment around you, what you can drink, right? So you kind of see the world through the desire, right? But when you fast, what you are able to do is see the desire itself, because it's pulling you to act on it, but you have to restrain yourself and use some self-control, like pulling in the reins on a horse. Your desires are like the horses. They want to gallop off into the world and satisfy themselves, but you pull back on the reins. And then what happens is, by not acting on the desire, you become more aware of, your attention is more directed at the desire itself, and you can see the desire, and you can cultivate the ability to not act on it, right? And the more you do that, the more you can look at like hunger pains and things like that and just say, oh yes, that's just that sensation associated with that desire, right? And when you can look at it that way, you've taken a step back and you have more control over it, right? This, by the way, that same functional shift in your attention, right? It's like a figure ground shift, you know, and sometimes you look at a diagram like a hollow cube and you see the bottom part of it first, and then you can only look at it that way. But if you really wiggle around your attention, you could say, oh no, the upper square is you could look at it as if that's the one in front, right? That's a figure ground shift, right? Or with some kind of, these are called ambiguous images. If an ambiguous image is one that you could look at in two different ways, but whichever way you first look at it, it's hard to unlock yourself from that way of looking at it, right? When you can unlock yourself, you're breaking frames, so to speak. You have a figure ground shift and you can see it another way, right? Okay, so when you practice meditation also, which the Stoics practice, right? Whenever you're practicing meditation, you have to control your desires, because you're sitting there doing some mental practice or whatever it is. You have desire to go get a drink or go get something to eat or answer your phone or whatever it is, but you don't act on it because you're focused, right? But so this is just an interesting thing. These are just a couple of examples of the ways in which you actually have the ability to control your own emotions, thoughts, desires, and even to some extent your beliefs, depending on what kind of information you willfully expose your mind and senses to in order to cultivate more accurate beliefs about those topics, right? So there's so many ways in which we can change. God grant me this, the courage to change the things that I can. There's so many ways in which we could change the structure of our own psyches and our bodies and our lives, right? And the Stoics are all about that. So they are not Stoic in the modern sense of fatalistically accepting whatever happens to them and not caring about anything. No, quite the opposite. Okay. So when they fast, it's develop an iron will, right? And we'll say more about that in a moment. Okay, so they have what are called the 3 Stoic disciplines, which are for building good habits, which is what we were just talking about, right? And they are the discipline of desire, the discipline of action, and the discipline of assent, which is like about belief. I told you we can control our beliefs in a way, right? So one at a time, we'll go through it. Discipline of desire is we can cultivate self-control. We can cultivate the ability to postpone immediate gratification for greater long-term rewards, right? Which is called prudential reasoning or prudential desires, right? Right? Like you might want to go hang out with your friends or go play video games or whatever else you might want to do, because those will give you some fun right now. Or you can defer your fun so that you have now, you have to say a certain amount. Say, let's say if there were fun units, 5 fun units that you could have tonight, and maybe 5 unfun units by doing your homework and studying and reading and whatever and taking quizzes and whatnot, so that you improve your life, so that a year from now, you know, or a half a year from now, when you graduate, you have a degree, you could get a better job and have a lot more money, so you could buy a better version of your video game and have 10 units of fun on a daily basis instead of 5, right? That's prudential reasoning, deferred gratification, postponing your rewards, your immediate rewards now for greater, lesser immediate rewards now for greater rewards in the future. That's prudential desires, right? And yes, but Buddhism, by the way, has all three of these things, but they're called by different things. So I'm mentioning it now because we have a lecture on Buddhism later on this semester. The Buddhists will call this right intention. And by the word right, they don't mean morally right. They just mean strategic, right? Practical, oriented towards your attainment of total mental freedom and enlightenment, Buddhahood. Okay, that's what they mean by right. Right? Your intentions, your desires, your motives, your cravings, those are all in the same category. So by disciplining those, you cultivate really good habits, and those are things you can control. And just like Aristotle said, anything you try to do, you do it well by doing it frequently, right? How do you become good at playing the guitar? By playing the guitar a lot, right? How do you become good at basketball? By playing basketball a lot, right? Not once in a blue moon. Okay, so for example, the marshmallow test. I'm sure you've heard of it, but this is an old psychology test where you put a little kid in a room and they put a marshmallow on the table, and the experimenter says, just so you know, you could have that marshmallow now. I'm going to go inside for a few minutes. If when I come back, that's still here, I'll give you another marshmallow, right? So you could have one now, or you could have two in a few minutes, right? And the experimenter leaves and comes back, and a certain number of the kids ate the marshmallow and a certain number of them didn't. They get the second marshmallow. Well, tracking those kids later in life show that the ones that waited for the second marshmallow, who were therefore able to defer immediate gratification, postpone a smaller reward now for a greater reward later, did better in almost every other measure in life. Okay, so that's just a little tidbit. The discipline of action is similarly only engaging in actions. Well, desires lead to actions, right? Like grabbing the one marshmallow as opposed to waiting. That's another action. And then getting the two marshmallows, right? So not only do you discipline your desires, but you discipline when you put them into action and how you put them into action. That's the discipline of action. Only engaging, the Stoics will, like the Buddhists, will only engage in actions that cultivate virtues, right? And the Buddhists call that right action, right? Strategic actions. Right? Addictive behaviors lead to non-control, right? Like, drinking alcohol every single day for a month. At the end of that month, you're liable to be addicted to it, right? Whereas having a glass of wine with your dinner once a week is not going to have that impact on you, right? So addictive behaviors, any behavior in excess can become addictive, right? That's not right action. That's not discipline of action. Okay, last one. Discipline of assent. When you assent to a statement, you approve of it. It's like saying, I concur with your statement, right? So philosophers believe that for any proposition, any statement, any meaningful claim, right, we have in our mind the ability to accept it or reject it or to withhold judgment about it and remain neutral. Now, some things are so obviously true that we can't help but accept them. We are forced, where necessarily our mind will assent to it. Dissent is when you disagree, like Supreme Court judge disagrees with the others and the majority, the dissenting views of the people who lost in the Supreme Court case, they're giving you their other opinion, right? Dissent and assent, right? Disagreement and agreement, right? So yeah, and then some statements are so obviously true, like I said, like 1 + 1 = 2, that you have to assent to them. Others are so obviously false, that you cannot assent to them, like 1 + 1 = 12, right? Or a triangle has only 2 sides, right? If you know what those things mean, you have to agree or disagree with them if they're obviously true or obviously false. And then there are those things that are neither obviously true nor obviously false. Those are the ones that's control, right? That's the range where we have some control. It's all about what can we control, what can't we? In the range of claims that we can accept or reject, that's where we should pay attention, right? And only accept beliefs or claims on good evidence and good reasoning and good methods or good epistemology, right? Don't believe anything without good evidence or good reasons. And the Buddhists call that right view, right? Only accept views that are oriented toward greater virtue and freedom and Buddhahood and so on. Okay, so 3 Stoic disciplines, belief, desire, and action. I would reword the third one into belief, discipline of belief. Okay, so fasting is just one of the voluntary hardships that Stoics occasionally practice. Like, occasionally, maybe once a week, you give yourself a really good workout. You go out for a 5-mile run, and on the other days, you just do a little stretching or whatever, right? It's their attitude is something like that. This is not something to do all the time, but to do periodically, but fairly regularly, so that you cultivate habits, right? The category voluntary hardships includes fasting, right? That's just one kind of voluntary hardship. So fasting means not acting on your desires for food and drink, but sex, speech, entertainment, all sorts of things, right? Massages, things you enjoy, swimming, whatever it is, video games, right? That's entertainment. Okay, another category that's not the same as fasting, but it's related. You might be saying fasting from good clothing, right? Or fasting from not acting on the desire to wear warm clothes when it's cold out, right? Or not acting on your desire to have comfortable sneakers on when you're going out running, but instead going out barefoot, right? But so whether or not you could classify all these things as something like fasting, well, they all share this idea of not acting on desires that we want to act on normally, right? And not avoiding things so much also that we want to avoid. So we want to avoid being underdressed in the cold, right? But what they do is they voluntarily do this every now and then. They'll voluntarily, instead of, if they normally always like to dress well, they'll dress poorly, right? So that they also outgrow other people's opinions of them. Like Epictetus said, don't look for others for approval. If you do that, you jeopardize your own integrity, right? So like they'll purposely do things that might sever their attachment to other people's opinions, like wear ragged clothes or walk around barefoot when everyone else has shoes on, or be underdressed out in the cold in the wintertime for a brief period or something like that. Sleep on the floor, sleep outside, sleep without a blanket or a pillow. Take cold showers when it's cold out, hot showers when it's hot out, right? Have skimpy, cheap meals, no spice, no salt, cold food that normally hot, right? This is just breaking habits is what it is. Breaking frames and breaking habits. Any kind of disruptive routine, going home on a different route. Maybe you go home the same way every day, right? From your job or from your school or whatever it is. Go another way, right? Break habits, break your habits. That gives you more freedom. Engage in somewhat embarrassing behavior, right? Confess something embarrassing, right? Take an embarrassing position. Step out of your comfort zone, right? Start paying attention to your comfort zone, because guess what? Your comfort zone from a Stoic perspective is a little prison that you've built by not stepping outside of your comfort zone. And that is something you can change, but it takes courage, right? So there's a lot of practical wisdom in Stoicism, which is why it's experiencing a great revival in the contemporary era in which we live, when a lot of people just lost faith in their religion and they need some kind of meaning. That's a meaning crisis, like I said, right? The old gods don't seem to work for us anymore. Stoicism is a really practical philosophy that almost anybody can adopt, at least adopt elements of. And the Stoics engage in meditations, not just this kind where you sit with your legs crossed and your hands like this, and you close your eyes and you chant, Om. That's the popular form of meditation that everybody seems to know about, right? Their meditations involve thinking, right? Some Asian, like some forms of Zen Buddhism and other kinds of meditation involve you trying to stop thinking, right? And that's where that picture is, the person sitting in the meditation pose with little diagrams of their alleged energy centers, their chakras, right? Stoicism isn't about that kind of meditation. There's still meditations. You sit quietly with eyes closed or open. And here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them, right? We'll start with the top one, premeditatio, which means meditation beforehand, right? So in the morning, even maybe when you're lying in bed or you sit up in the morning, having your coffee, you pause to meditate and think of the day ahead and try to visualize the day ahead and visualize some things that you know based on your agenda or your calendar, what you're going to face. You're going to work, or you're going to a party, or whatever, a wedding, or whatever it is, and imagine something going wrong. Imagine one of your dispreferred but indifferent things happening to you, like you're on the BQE, the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, you're late for class, and your car conks out. Oh, what am I going to do? I'm going to miss the midterm, right? Whatever it is. Imagine something like that happening. This is the advice for premeditatio. Just visualize some negative thing that you don't want to happen and visualize you handling it in a Stoic fashion and imagine what that would be like, right? It's kind of like if you go for martial arts training, so one of the trainings for self-defense is to imagine how you will react if somebody tries to mug you and to have a plan, right? You throw your wallet the other way and you run this way, right? And you don't keep your money in that wallet. It's a toss wallet or whatever, right? By having these things in your mind, you're creating a repertoire of ways to deal with these unexpected disappointments of life. Okay, that's premeditatio. I'll jump down to post-meditatio or post-meditation. At the end of the day, Stoics will sit or lie in bed and close their eyes and review the entire day from the moment they woke up until now, or backwards from now till the moment that they woke up, looking for any little moments in the day, any events or occurrences or actions or decisions or whatever, emotions, which involve this kind of negative experience, something dispreferred, right? That you didn't respond to in a Stoic way, and try and think about it, realize how you failed to be a Stoic, and think of ways that you could have and should have responded in a Stoic fashion so that you didn't lose your equanimity, right? That's post, so pre and post. Some do both the pre and the post in a journal. And your English teachers would love this idea, journaling, right? So they write it all down. They don't just sit there thinking it in their head. They think it and write it and think it and write it, or they're just thinking as they're writing, right? And those journals are very, very useful. In fact, Marcus Aurelius, that emperor, philosopher, king, most of his writings were in his journals. They were to himself, right? And they're fascinating. You might want to go read them. You could probably get them for free on the internet. Okay, the second bullet, the big picture, I call it, but the Stoics typically call it the view from above with all capital letters, right? Is where you do close your eyes like the person in the picture here, right? And you imagine expanding your awareness above your body, maybe up to your ceiling, and looking down at your body, and then up to the top of your house or whatever building you're in, and looking through transparently, seeing your body, and then higher and higher up in the air, and then up in the clouds, and then, you know, where you could see the whole planet like blue and white in the pictures, and then up by the moon looking down at the earth, and then further and further out. So you're at all the stars in the galaxy, and the sun is just one little twinkling star, right? And you can expand as far as you can in your imagination, as if you could feel all of that. And the point of that, the view from above, is to see how little everything going on down here really matters, and to take in the big picture, right? That kind of puts things in perspective, and it certainly breaks frame, like I said, in that figure ground shift, looking at the cube one way or the other, right? You're literally breaking frame by just kind of looking at, well, you know what, in the course of eternity, the span from birth to death is like the blink of an eye, and it's a tiny little dot in the middle of an infinite horizon of space. It just helps to put things in perspective, right? Your problems might seem so huge because you're caught right in the middle of them, but when you take on the bigger perspective, you realize, you know what? 1,000 years after I'm gone, nobody will even know. All right, that's just to help you shift perspectives. Prosoche or prososh, I'm not sure, I've heard it pronounced two different ways, just means attention. And that's very similar to a Buddhist practice called mindfulness, where you just simply pay attention. Now, in the Buddhist practice, you can pay attention to anything, but there are certain things that are prescribed, like close your eyes and pay attention to your breath coming in and out of your nostrils, or in your throat, or in your lungs moving in and out, or your belly moving in and out as you breathe, right? Or just pay attention to sound, or just pay attention to your thoughts, or pay attention to all the feelings in your body, or just pay attention to the emotions, like those kind of positive and negative sensations that you have, right? So there's a whole list of things that Buddhists will pay attention to, right, in different sequences. This is similar to that, but different. Attending to means, it means like the Buddhists practice this with their eyes closed, right? And then they try to carry it over into life by paying attention to what they're doing, right? It's like, oh, I'll pay attention while I'm sitting still. It's harder when I'm engaged in activities. But the Stoics apply this to their activities, right? Not to sitting quietly, right? So it's a kind of attempt to be mindful of whatever it is that you're doing. And it's kind of like the opposite of multitasking. You could put it that way, right? When we're doing a lot of different things, we're sort of mindless about some of them, right? Like if you're on the cell phone while you're riding your bike to school or something like that, you're having an argument with your spouse or your girlfriend or your boyfriend or your mother or whatever it is, right? And you're really, or just an interesting conversation, you might not even remember what route you took by the time you get there because you weren't paying attention to that fully, right? So the attitude about this is completely pay attention to everything that you do. And while you're paying attention, be mindful of the distinction, the dichotomy of control. Focus on what you can control and on self-control, okay? And I already talked about journaling. Okay, so here's some characteristics of the ideal Stoic, right? And that's, you know, an outfit from the era of the original Stoics. We'll start on the upper left. They're serene and confident, right? They're calm, right? Like a warrior. A warrior isn't like all nervous, right? When he walks into a situation that's going to be troublesome, he's serene, right? I don't know if you've ever had a kind of aggressive encounter with somebody who wasn't at all nervous and they were dead calm. What does that let you know, right? They're in control of their emotions. That can be very frightening to someone who's not, okay? They're confident and serene. Second one down, they act reasonably because it's all about rationality. It's irrational to worry about and act on things that are beyond our control. Okay, third item down, focuses on what he controls or she, accepts fate graciously. Fate is the things you can't control, right? Unattached to external things, right? I can fast. I'm not attached to those things. I can take them or leave them. They're indifferent to me. There's some I prefer and some I disprefer. And if I get the ones that I prefer, that's enjoyable. If I get the ones I disprefer, that's a little bit of suffering, but I'm still indifferent. I'm not attached to the outcome. Okay, right side the list, grateful and calm, right? Yeah, Stoics, like the Epicureans, have an appreciation for this life, right? The range of the life that they can control. They appreciate the preferred indifference when they can enjoy them, right? They're grateful. But they're also not perturbed. They don't get all super excited because they're enjoying their experience, right? It's kind of like neurotic over excitement leads to and borders on agitation or lack of balance, right? They are kind and generous because they can be, right? What's the point of not being? Right? Because they're not attached so much that they can be generous and they can be kind, right? They take full responsibility for their lives, right? Because they're in control of them. It's up to them. They're exercising strength of will, not weakness of will. They're not a victim, right? Oh, it's all everything else's fault. I'm such a victim. No, right? They take full responsibility because they really are in control of themselves. They are supremely virtuous, right? Because they have courage and wisdom and serenity and all these other virtues that they cultivate because those are the things that they can cultivate, right? They can't control things beyond their control, but they can and do control the things that they can and do control. And that's what they focus on. And they're mindful of it all the time, right? And that's why, last item, they live in complete harmony with their lives, with themselves, with each other, with society, their family, with the world, with nature. Those are some characteristics of an ideal Stoic. And it's a great ideal. And I mentioned this a number of times. There's a contemporary Stoic revival, a reinterest in it, right? There's a book on the right by Massimo Pigliucci, which is a CUNY professor up at City University of New York, uptown Manhattan. How to be a Stoic, subtitle, using ancient philosophy to live a modern life. I know Massimo. He's actually one of the contributors to a book that I'm almost done editing, and which is going to go off to the publisher shortly. It's been accepted. I have the contract and everything else, called the Routledge, Routledge. Routledge is a big academic publisher. It's called the Routledge Handbook on the Philosophy of Meditation. And so Massimo Pigliucci is writing one of the chapters about the Stoics' attitudes about meditation and prosoche and all those other things, right? But yeah, I think one of the reasons why in my second bullet we have what it says in the first bullet, which is a contemporary Western revival of Stoicism, is it's because we're in a post-religious meaning crisis. We have a kind of modern vacuum. With the rise of science, you've got the kind of drop of religion. People lose their faith because science undermines the claims of the Bible. It just does, right? So that kind of makes them all hard to believe, right? And so now you see a lot of Westerners, people in the Western world, which is Europe and the United States and other English-speaking countries, right? Embracing Buddhism and Hinduism and yoga and Tai Chi and Qigong and all these other interesting things like Zen and whatnot, right? And they're all fine. They're wonderful. I'm interested in all those things, but they're foreign. They're not Western, right? Stoicism comes out of the Greco-Roman heritage of the West, right? Ancient Greece and Rome. So it resonates with our cultural grammar, our cultural way of looking at the world, our cultural worldview, our cultural mindset, right? It kind of just slips right in. It fits, right? It comes out of the same cultural history that we came out of, right? And yet at the same time, it embraces daily, everyday life and science. It doesn't require you to believe in supernatural beings, that fairy tales or anything else that's like not really credible, which if you were required to believe in those things, you would not be inclined to believe in Stoicism, right? It doesn't require belief in invisible beings, right? And therefore it doesn't require you to get into religious wars over people who believe in other invisible beings. I'm being critical right now, right? But it does offer a comprehensive philosophy of life, right? Discipline of belief, desire, and action. The three, if you made a pyramid, right, in the psychology of a human being, you've got beliefs, desires, and actions, right? Beliefs are thoughts that you think are true, right? Based on those thoughts, you've got a map of reality. And based on those beliefs, some of them are beliefs about what things are worthy of desiring. So if you believe that there's life after death and there's a God, and that prayer puts you into a better relationship with God, that will lead to the desire for you to pray and go to church more often, or synagogue or mosque or whatever it is, right? But if you don't believe in any of that, then you will have different desires, right? If you believe this is all that there is, then your desires will be more rationally oriented toward this world, right? So in this way, belief dictates what's worth desiring, right? Whatever you think is true tells you what you should want. So belief is the primary thing, and that guides desire. And desire leads to your actions, right? You want those things that are in this life, or you want those things that are in the afterlife, just comparing those two things as an example. And so you either go to church or you go to parties, right? I'm going to have fun in this life. No, I'm going to have my fun in the next life, right? So beliefs dictate your desires, and your desires dictate your actions, right? It's a kind of, and it's cyclical. The more you perform a certain kind of action based on a certain kind of desire, the gratification that you get back feeds back into your belief, which then is, it's worthwhile pursuing that desire. Bam. So now you pursue it more, and then you act more, and then it becomes a habit. It's kind of like a vicious or virtuous cycle, depending on whether or not that belief, desire, and action is wholesome for your overall well-being, your ataraxia, your eudaimonia, your eudaimonia, or well-being, right? Okay. And that's the end of that. So let me stop the share so you can see my beautiful face. And remember, Stoicon, Stoicon. Google it. You just missed this one, but you might be able to, I'm sure at least some YouTube's clips from it will be, if not the whole thing, will be available. So you could see it at your leisure, right? But you might want to go to one of them if they're in New York. Oh, and by the way, Massimo Pigliucci, my friend, he's at City University of New York, but also at the CUNY Graduate Center. CUNY is City University of New York. He's in charge of a lot of Stoic events in New York City. He does a whole bunch of them throughout the year. And there's some kind of meetup thing that he does for Stoics. So you could, if you really want to look into it and connect with a community of Stoics, it's kind of like a good, healthy substitute for, something like church, but it's more like a philosophy. It's not more like a religion, but it's a philosophy that satisfies a good chunk of what religion used to satisfy. And so it's worth looking into. That's Epicureanism and Stoicism. I believe in our next lecture, we have skepticism and Neoplatonism. Neo means new, right? Plotinus or Plotinus. One of the major skeptics was Pyrrho, Pyrrho. And then a little bit of Christianity, like St. Augustine. And then that will be the end. So I think it's just one more lecture on the ancient Greco-Roman philosophy era and geography, after which we will move over to India. So I hope this was enjoyable, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for your attention and your time.